G'day folks, welcome to this playthrough of Scenario 5, Descent into Hell from Operation Mercury, part of that grand tactical series by MMP. This is a fascinating scenario, 48-hour scenario roughly, which reflects the Luftlande Storm Regiment landing around Malmö airfield and the Fallschirmjäger Regiment 3 landing to the south-southwest of the Chania area out in the open. They have a choice between two objectives. They can either try to secure the airfield out in the west, or they can try to exit 3 units towards Chania in the northeast. So the Germans have a choice here. If they can achieve one of those objectives, they win. Now, I'll say from the outset that just to try something a bit different here, I made the decision from the start to focus on the airfield. And those Fallschirmjäger Regiment 3 troops landing out in the sort of southeast area of the map are determined to go and reinforce the Storm Regiment landing out there in the west. We'll see how this goes. Basically, the Germans are focusing all their efforts on the airfield. If they can secure the airfield, they get these reinforcements arriving on the 21st of May. So that's where they're focused. Now, with that in mind, the Germans do their landings. There's some gliders and paratroops, and things go remarkably well. The Germans had just a suite of beautiful rolls throughout here. When they generally rolled pretty low, when they really needed to roll low, they rolled low. When they could afford to roll high, they rolled high. In all these landings across this map, they had really one bad roll out in the east, which caused a company to be eliminated. And there was one other step lost out in the west. There were a few, maybe 1 or 2 extra paratroop landing markers placed. All the rest landed without any incident, which is just remarkable. If I could save this moment and start every scenario as the Germans like this, it would be great. So you can see here the landings. There's Germans kind of scattered throughout a lot of these Allied positions, and they're almost immediately in trouble. Again, they rolled pretty low, so no step losses for the most part, but very close to Malmö airfield, close to some of those Allied artillery parks, and then in the centre-east area of the map, kind of out in the open. And as I said, these guys are going to very quickly begin their march to the west. So with these paratroop markers, the Germans basically have to spend their first activation to clear those markers, which gives kind of the Allies a bit of a time to respond. The main problem in this scenario for the Allies is that they have very low command at the start. They can't activate the Crete forces, those sort of dark brown units, and so they're very restricted in what they can do. Once those paratroop markers are cleared, the Germans make this immediate dash for the airfield. We have one company seizing the eastern end of the airfield, and I should also point out the Germans start with 4 airstrikes, and they struck pretty well. They caused 2 cohesion hits on armoured units. They eliminated a few of the zero-step, I think they were AA guns among the Allied forces. But yeah, immediately pushing for that airfield, Malmö airfield on the coast. Another problem for the Germans here is a lot of their guns require sort of prolonging to move forward. And every time they try to move a bit forward, they have to roll for a troop quality check. Having said that, they do get pretty lucky with their rolls. So basically, they have a 50% chance of moving forward, a 50% chance of failing and suffering a cohesion hit. And these are really important guns. The Germans don't have a lot of sort of heavy firepower in this area, so those guns are going to be very important, particularly with the threat of these light Allied tanks. Fairly quickly, we have Germans seizing the western end of Malmö airfield, which leaves the Germans occupying that centre hex space under the red dot. Now, defending in this area under all those improved positions is the 5th New Zealand Brigade, and they have some pretty strong units. And I'll mention it here, one of the biggest advantages the Allies have is their light mortar units. These have the purple fire rating. And this enables these units to fire during a divisional activation. Normally, units can't fire in the first action of their divisional activation, with the exception of units that have light mortars. This means that all these Allied units, the 5th New Zealand Brigade, the 4th New Zealand Brigade, which we'll see in a moment, that have these light mortars, can fire quite freely during these division activations, in addition to their formation activations. The biggest disadvantage they have at this stage is command. The Allies are low on command, and so they struggle to place their formation activation counters in the cup. So really, this 5th New Zealand Brigade at this stage, and for many of the early hours on the 20th of May, are just defending and hoping for the best. You can see they're becoming battered, suppressed, attacked by the Germans of the Storm Regiment, which have more command and can move around more freely. Now, by the 1100 turn, the Germans have really pressed in on the airfield. They are focusing their mortar fire, their dual-purpose guns on those New Zealanders in that centre airfield hex. In addition to being the victory point objective, this is really what the Germans are focused on to win the scenario. The airfield is important because it will enable them to bring on their, what are called serials reinforcements on the evening of the 21st of May. If the Germans hold 2 adjacent hexes of that airfield, they can bring on these quite strong reinforcements from the 5th Gebirge Division. And this will be a huge boost to their positions. It almost doubles the size of their forces. This is a long way off, though. These reinforcements potentially arrive, I think, the 1700 and 1900 turn of the 21st of May, shortly before the scenario ends. So the Germans are trying to do 2 things: hold the airfield to win the scenario, but also hold the airfield for historical purposes and to bring on these reinforcements. The Allies, of course, are trying to prevent that from happening. But at present, they, as you can see in this image, are being smashed by German mortars, dual-purpose guns, and those superior German troops with a better troop quality rating and better firepower. The Germans also have a -1 innate defence modifier on a lot of their infantry units, which really helps them in the defence. Something to keep in mind as we look at this image is the open ground around Malmö airfield. This is going to be critical moving forward. Because Malmö airfield is a focus of fighting, because both the Germans and the Allies want to seize that airfield, prevent their opponent from getting it, they're focusing all their effort here. They're rushing all their troops into this area. There are, of course, a lot of mortars. There's the light mortars, the German green normal mortars. There's the dual-purpose guns, and they're all firing into this open terrain, which creates this large killing zone around Malmö airfield. I'd estimate, having played through this, that about 75 to 80% of the casualties in the scenario came in those sort of 3, 4, 5, 6 hexes around Malmö airfield. This is where all these troops rush in. At the same time, the Germans are trying to clear the New Zealand Brigade 5th New Zealand Brigade from the heights. You can see where those 3 light barrage markers are there. Now out in the east, the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment has packed up, formed in column, and begin rushing to the west. Now at this stage, they're trying to leave behind a few forces, and they are keeping their options open. They're waiting to see what the Allies do as well. But as I said, they would like to kind of get to the coast, do 2 things: prevent this whole eastern Allied force, Nicolás, from moving west, but also getting to the airfield quickly and helping the Sturm Regiment. So you can see them in column here as they begin their march sort of across the mountains to the west. The Allies take their time to respond. First of all, they want to be sure that the Germans aren't going to march on Hania, that they are, well, again, that they are actually going to move west and not sort of circle around and try and get those 3 units off in the east. So they kind of stay a bit stationary. A lot of the Allies are under their improved positions, and they're reluctant to leave those improved positions initially. Having set up this kind of good defensive line, they're not keen to leave their trenches, basically. Okay, so as we head into the 1 o'clock turn, the fighting around the airfield intensifies. A few of these New Zealanders start to move towards the airfield to help out their beleaguered companies. The Germans slowly press in. Their guns, their dual-purpose guns, start to move forward and start to get in range with clear lines of sight to those airfield hexes. And again, we're focusing here. The Germans occupy the eastmost hex of the airfield and the westmost hex, with a single New Zealand company occupying that centre hex. It's critical because at present, while the Germans occupy 2 of the 3, they don't occupy 2 adjacent hexes. Whilst, again, sort of in the centre area, the Germans continue their march in column across the map to the west. Okay, so heading into the 1500 turn, and you can see the New Zealanders now have pushed up against the airfield. They've left their improved positions, which is a risk. This is the 5th New Zealand Brigade with the blue band. They've got mortars in the area. You can still see a couple of isolated Germans to the east around Contamari. They hold out pretty well. Again, their innate defence. They're in these olive groves, which gives them an additional -1 modifier. So they're at -2 against these 5th New Zealand Brigades, which have kind of a typical firepower of 3 or 4, using either small arms or their light mortars. So it's hard to cause damage on these Germans, although you can see 2 cohesion hits build up at this point. And again, the German guns pushing even closer. If you can see just to the west of the airfield, one of the guns within range of 2 of the New Zealanders on that airfield. And again, it's the same old story out in the east with the Germans marching across. Now they're trying to, what's happening here is they're moving west, kind of northwest, trying to make a line to the coast, and they keep both the 5th New Zealand Brigade and another New Zealand Brigade in this area are trying to block them. So you can see these sort of improved positions being set up, blocking those roads to the coast. And this is kind of really frustrating the Germans as they're trying to get to the coast to block, as you can see in the north here. This is the 4th New Zealand Brigade with a green band, and they have packed up their improved positions. They've formed column, and they're using these roads to rapidly move to the west, realising what the Germans are doing, giving up their improved positions and going to support the 5th New Zealand Brigade out in the west. So this becomes a race. You have the 3rd Volksjager Regiment trying to get to the coast, trying to march across land, being blocked by sort of these scattered New Zealanders, and they're racing these 4th New Zealand Brigade companies who are using the coast road. The Germans have kind of a head start. They packed up first, but the 4th New Zealanders have the road and those blocking troops inland. As we head into the 1700 turn, the Germans are rushing more troops into the airfield area. Heroic company rises to the west, and more of these guns are getting closer. The Germans now have 2 mortars in the area which can lay barrage on that airfield, which is causing a lot of damage to those New Zealanders. To the kind of southeast of this area, the Germans continue to be frustrated by these sort of scattered 5th New Zealand Brigade companies blocking their way to the north. In response, the 3rd Volksjager Regiment has put themselves in column and are trying to outflank the New Zealanders, moving through this kind of olive grove and rough terrain. They move quite rapidly over here. When in column, it's 1 movement point per space, but not quite as fast as the 4th New Zealand Brigade along the coast, as you can see up in the north. Finally, at the end of this turn, the Storm Regiment clears out that centre hex, largely with the help of that heroic unit, and they advance, pushing the New Zealanders back. So at this stage, the Germans have seized all 3 hexes of the airfield. They hold, well, certainly at least 2 adjacent hexes of the airfield. They have achieved their victory conditions. They have enabled these glider landings to proceed on the 21st of May. They just need to hold these positions. And again, keeping in mind, this is open terrain, and they have this 5th New Zealand Brigade all around them. Now, the biggest problem for the Germans at this stage is this big push on that central hex of the airfield exhausted pretty much all their command and dispatch points. They've been placing the Storm Regiment into the cup each turn, which is costing them a lot of dispatch points. They've been spending a lot of command points to gain dispatch points and to get these second actions wherever possible to try and push. It's worked. They've seized the airfield, but now they're really running low on both dispatch and command points. And as we head into the 1900 turn, we have a lot of Allied forces activating in the east, including the 19th Australian Brigade and Crete, which again will begin the march to the west. So stepping back, looking at the bigger picture out here in the west, you can see the 3 hexes of the airfield occupied. The Germans now trying to clear the surrounding hexes. Now the 5th New Zealand Brigade still holds the heights in this area. They still have some improved positions upslope around that hilly terrain. They have mortars behind the lines, but again you can see how close the 4th New Zealand Brigade is to reinforcing those positions. The night turn was pretty quiet. The Germans desperately needed this, having seized the airfield, having suffered a lot of cohesion hits, which you may have noticed in those earlier images. They were relieved to be able to spend this time recovering some cohesion hits and moving their troops further up to help in the airfield area. So, in the morning of the 21st of May, the 4th New Zealand Brigade arrives alongside and links up with the 5th New Zealand Brigade, so blue and green linking together, and they almost immediately begin a kind of counter push on this airfield. And it sees almost immediate success. They seize the eastern end of the airfield. The problem for the Germans here is that whilst they occupy these 3 airfield hexes, it's hard to reinforce. The 4th New Zealanders still occupy that space just south of the central hex of the airfield, so they can fire on the Germans as they move around. So it's hard, in particular, for the Germans to move troops around to that southeast area without suffering opportunity fire. There's both the New Zealanders adjacent, they have some machine guns in this area, and there's also a tank somewhere among this infantry which has a range of 2 from memory, which is firing on these Germans as they try to move around. In addition to that, they don't really have a lot of infantry companies in this area. Yes, the Germans have great troop quality and slightly superior firepower, but they have fewer numbers of companies, and they're now outnumbered by the 4th and 5th New Zealand Brigades. Slightly southeast, the 3rd Regiment with the red band has arrived just south of the airfield, and they begin marching up the hill from the south, kind of to pin the 4th New Zealand Brigade between their position and the airfield. You've also got the 5th New Zealanders up on the hill as well. There's a lot of fighting going along this sort of Contamari area as kind of both the Germans and the Allies are trying to pin each other down in this area and prevent either side from accessing those connecting roads to the coast. Heading into the 0900 turn, and the 4th New Zealand Brigade are determined to hold their ground south and southwest of the airfield, up along the heights there, some olive groves. So you can see that line of green companies stretched sort of northeast to southwest, and it's preventing the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment from kind of directly linking up. And as a result, they're kind of trying to loop around to the west. It's taken them a long time, and this is kind of a critical moment because the 4th New Zealand Brigade holding that area makes it difficult for, again, these German regiments to manoeuvre and to get to the airfield. It's going to take them basically 2 extra actions to get around. Over in the east, Crete is slowly making their way, and up in the north along that road, this is the 3 companies of the 19th Australian Brigade. Now heading into the 11 a.m. turn on the 21st of May, the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, the red banded units, trying to kind of loop around to the west, but also partly they're trying to eliminate these 4th New Zealand Brigade companies blocking their way. If they can kind of clear this road out, if they can clear these heights, it will relieve a lot of pressure on those Sturm regiments in the airfield. Now, though, of course, the Allies have, I think there are 3 light tank squadrons in this area. They have the combined mortars of the 4th and the 5th New Zealand Brigades. And again, this becomes critical. There are about 3 or 4 mortar units in this area. And whilst they are 0-step units, with a firepower of just 3, they maintain this sort of fire rate throughout this day, which causes the occasional hit on this German infantry. Keeping in mind, green mortar units cause a step loss on a roll of 0, and there are just enough of them to cause the occasional step loss throughout the day, which really hurts the Germans. Now, behind the lines to the southeast, the Allies are getting the upper hand here. They're gradually wearing down. It's taking a long time, but they're gradually wearing down and eliminating some of these isolated German companies behind the lines. And this frees up more of those troops and gradually frees up more of the 5th New Zealand Brigade to reinforce the position up in the northwest near the airfield. Here's a close-up of the action. You can see the Allies, the 5th and 4th New Zealand Brigades, are throwing everything at this eastern end of the airfield. This is quite a large stack. At some points it gets up to 6 steps, which makes it vulnerable to German guns. And keeping in mind that these German guns that you can see on the left here, there's the flak and 2 direct fire piece, dual purpose guns, 3 in total, can, for the most part, reach the eastern end of the airfield and fire directly on these Allied positions. So the Allies are suffering quite heavy casualties by holding this airfield and trying to push, but keeping in mind the Germans still hold 2 adjacent hexes. But the Germans are also suffering. Up until this point, it's around the 11 a.m. Midday turn on the 21st of May, the Germans had inflicted more casualties on the Allies. And I'll show you this in just a moment. But this is around where the tide turns. The presence of these Allied mortars, their tanks, the 4th New Zealand Brigade starting to hit, the regular fire of their light mortars, the arrival of the 19th Australian Brigade, only 3 companies, all begins to kind of shift the casualty rate such that the Germans begin to suffer more and more. You can see those cohesion hits built up. Now at this point, with their single remaining company on the airfield almost eliminated, the Germans are trying to rush their troops around to reinforce that hex. In the process, you can see in the center there a suppressed unit. That's actually a German unit. I've placed the wrong cohesion marker, but they're trying to move as quickly as possible along the roads to get to that airfield. You can see here how the Germans hold that airfield with just 1 step, suppressed, 2 cohesion hits. 1 more cohesion hit or a suppression would eliminate them. And then, as luck would have it, the Germans drew a direct command chit, and they spend a lot of command trying to rotate their kind of paratroop companies, Fallschirmjäger companies, around to reinforce that hex. They barely managed to do so. They suffer some cohesion along the way, but for now, they still hold that centre airfield hex, and they kind of rotate their troops to reform the line. You also have some companies from the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment now being able to help out, and they start to rush into this area as well. Now at this point, this is at the end of the 1100 turn, this is the casualty rate. So you can see a lot of 5th New Zealand Brigade blue-banded casualties. Just the 1 4th New Zealand Brigade casualty thus far, but this will build up quite rapidly. The Germans, you can see the Sturm Regiment has lost 5 companies. The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment has lost just 1. But this is, as I said, is where the tide starts to turn, and these German casualties build up quite rapidly after this. So heading into the 1300 turn, the Germans re-secure that central airfield hex and build up some forces to the southwest of that. This is again being bolstered by that red-banded 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, which has kind of moved around the western end of those green-banded 4th New Zealand Brigade positions. Germans are also trying to press from the south, but not having much success. And mainly this comes down to their fire rate. A single German company typically only fires once in a turn. Typical company of the 4th New Zealand Brigade will fire twice. And although the Germans have a slightly higher firepower, two attacks against one certainly benefits the Allies. Now, another critical moment comes in the 1300 turn. The Allies throw a lot of their forces at that central hex. Again, the eastern end of the airfield has a big stack of Allied units, and they're pouring firepower against those poor German units in the centre with their mortars, their artillery, and it eliminates the defending Germans in this area within sort of the one activation. The Allies then draw direct command chit, and they spend some command points, which they have up their sleeve, to try to push some units into this area. First of all, we have C Company from, I think it's the 20th Battalion of the 4th New Zealand Brigade, Green Banded Unit, which tries to rush in, but they suffer opportunity fire and are eliminated as a result. We then have the Australians of the 19th Brigade behind the line. You can see them in the southeast. And C Company from the 2nd 8th Battalion also try to rush into the area. This is a full-strength company. It's just arrived, and my thinking here is the Australians will save the day. They'll seize the airfield. They rush in, suffer opportunity fire, and are instantly eliminated with a devastating roll. I think it was a German direct fire from somewhere nearby. Then it's left to A Company of the 20th Battalion. They also try to rush in. This is another command point with a direct command. They rush in, seize that central airfield, and don't suffer opportunity fire along the way. The Germans failed their role. So at this stage, by the end of the 1300 turn, the Allies have seized that central airfield hex. Incidentally, the next chit was German airstrike, and they tried to pour fire on the Allies throughout this airfield area. Unfortunately, they only caused the one cohesion hit on that A Company, and the rest of the airstrikes miss. Incidentally, the Allies then drew a heroic event, and they placed a heroic counter on that important company now holding the central airfield. This then takes us to the 1500 turn, and by this stage, the Germans are just one turn off the possibility of getting these reinforcements from the 5th Gebirge Division. Unfortunately, the Allies get the early chit activation in this turn, and they rush their armoured units into that central airfield hex. They reinforce it with more infantry. Again, this is a heavily stacked, there are about 6 steps now in this central airfield hex. There are mortars behind the lines, and by this stage, the Germans are suffering heavier and heavier casualties, largely from these mortars, artillery fire, and again, just these light mortars from all these 4th and 5th Brigade companies in this area, and they just can't respond. The Germans do get some reinforcements to the east, but they're kind of isolated and can't do much to join up. Just 2 small companies land just to the east of here, about 3-4 kilometres to the east of the airfield. The Germans don't give up. They continue pushing. They're rotating mainly companies of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment around, trying to get to the airfield. They still hold the westernmost hex, but again, these units are suffering suppression. You may be able to see some of those suppression and cohesion markers. These are quite large stacks, largely due to the kind of density of suppression and cohesion hits that these German units are suffering, and all these companies that the Allies are sending into this area. All throughout this, of course, you've still got those 5th New Zealanders holding that high ground just south of the airfield. They never gave up that high ground. They continue to resist and have held it for almost 24 hours now. So heading into the final turn, and you can see the density of these companies. I've kind of tried to tier them a bit so you can see what's here. You've got 2 companies of the 5th New Zealand Brigade stacked just south of the airfield, 2 companies of the 4th New Zealand Green Banded Brigade. They've got armoured squadrons with them, mortars behind the lines. Meanwhile, you've got a lot of German companies there as well, but again, they've suffered a lot of cohesion hits. They're suffering suppression. They've ran out of command points, so they can't sort of automatically pass these checks. And the Allies are just hitting them with so much that they can only make so many successful die rolls before they eventually fail and become suppressed. This suppression builds up, it turns into cohesion hits, they reduce their steps, and they're just not able to respond. So heading to the final turn, the Germans, they get another paradrop at this stage. This paradrop, as a sign kind of their fortune, goes quite badly. 2 additional markers placed, a couple of step losses here, and they're not in any position to retake the airfield. So ultimately, at the end of the scenario, the Allies hold so narrowly 2 of the 3 airfield hexes. The Germans hold the westernmost hex, and thus fail to achieve their objective. So it is an Allied victory, just as those units of Crete 4 begin to arrive in the south of this area. So things not looking good for the Germans. Their plan to focus everything on the airfield clearly failed. What it did was it freed up all those Allied forces in the east to shift west as well. The Germans thought, well, we'll just focus everything on the airfield and send all our forces there, and we'll outnumber the 5th New Zealand Brigade. Unfortunately, in the race to the west, the Allies won. It was because the Germans were prevented from accessing that coastal road. They had to march overland, and 4th New Zealand Brigade beat them to the airfield. It still was an incredibly close battle. The Germans ended the scenario with 0 dispatch points and 1 command point, which they're kind of holding up their sleeve, but not enough on the final turn. On the 1900 turn, they didn't have enough dispatch points to place any of their formations in the cup, and they were all spent as a force. Didn't have the command points to spend secondary activations, whereas the Allies had a lot of command and dispatch points up their sleeve. So that is Descent into Hell, Scenario 5 from Operation Mercury. Again, an incredibly close scenario, a lot of back and forth. The Germans captured the airfield, then they lost it just before their big reinforcements arrived. It was certainly a close thing, but really the efforts of the 4th and 5th New Zealand Brigades, focusing all their efforts on that airfield, won them the day, and may well have saved Crete without those strong German reinforcements being able to access the airfield.